Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining. I suppose, yeah, to follow what Kirsten has said, obviously this is focusing on NIS2, and I guess how some of the requirements of NIS2 are met by this kind of XDR service, and what you need to think about. Probably worth just refreshing briefly for everybody. I'm not going into the deep dive on all of NIS2, but it's probably just worth refreshing for everybody where we're at with NIS2. So NIS2 is obviously Network Information Security Directive 2, follows on from NIS-D, the original NIS directive in 2016. Following, I suppose, the evolution of most regulation in Europe, that NIS-D was really the prototype, if you like, to try and determine how to protect critical national infrastructure and essential services, but was limited in scope and effectiveness, and even in detail of I guess how to be compliant. Whereas NIS2 now is obviously, the real version, if you like, with real teeth. It's in law in Europe in that it's a directive, obviously, and the expectation was that it would be rolled out across all European states this time last year. Effectively October 2024. It's been delayed in a wide variety of countries because obviously there's significant implementation detail required. So it needs to be transposed into national law, i.e. it's a directive, so it's a high-level set of objectives, and then they've left the autonomy and latitude to each country to implement it in the relevant legislation. So Ireland published an initial heads of bill, if you like, but there's a lot of complexity both in the legislation and in some changes with the NCSC, etc., that is going through legislation. So it's anticipated. The best guidance we have at the moment is that the NIS2 directive, NIS2 regulations will be published either late Q4 2025, still promised, or possibly Q1 2026 because of that complexity and because of changes, things like the National Cybersecurity Centre, who will be the prime authority for this in Ireland, changing government department, etc., etc. So that is our best guidance. But I think it's fair to say in the market we're seeing a lot of customers anticipating, obviously, that this is coming. There's no way of dodging this bullet. Starting to, I suppose, trying to put in place NIS compliance programs and work programs to support that. And I think there's a point worth making here, which is, there's nothing in NIS2 that isn't best practice. So, the risks that organizations currently face, the challenges, there's been kind of haphazard implementation of best practice across the board, particularly with respect to kind of critical national infrastructure and essential services, but generally across the commercial sector and government sectors as well. So there's nothing in NIS2 that isn't best practice. And I think the advantage of something like NIS2 is it provides a lot of detail and prescription around what to do. So now, assuming everything is best practice in there, there's a lot of prescription around how to implement and what to implement to achieve and demonstrate compliance. So that's the current state in terms of when the law is likely to be transposed. A very significant shift from NIS1 is obviously, changing language from operators of essential services, etc., to important and essential entities. But much more importantly, there's a lot of additional sectors now in scope of the NIS directive. And it's now estimated that, for example, the number of entities that were regulated under NIS-D was approximately 70 to 80, whereas now the estimates are approximately 4,500 to potentially 6,000 organizations that will be in scope of NIS2 in Ireland. And, while it's very prescriptive, obviously, for the organizations that will be regulated under the NIS2 directive, it is also going to have very significant downstream supply chain impact, because what you're seeing is obviously the risks coming from and to supply chain, examples of that, right in the last 2 months, etc., across Europe. But I suppose, the NIS directive is not just going to have impact on the entities in scope. It's going to have impact downstream the supply chain. And you're probably going to find that a lot of the language, a lot of the concepts, a lot of the principles that apply in NIS2 will essentially be kind of forced down the supply chain, even if those organizations aren't regulated, by virtue of the due diligence that regulated entities will be doing on their supply chain. The goals ultimately is obviously to protect essential and important services, and to regulate and ensure that people are applying the appropriate best practices on a risk-based basis. And it's also then about building cybersecurity capabilities across Europe to protect all of those important and essential services. And it's that continuity of essential services and supply. So it's very important. It's coming. And I think organizations would be naive to simply wait for the legislation to be transposed and then start the program. I think you need to be preparing for it now. And certainly our experience is that a lot of organizations have started that preparation. Next slide, please, Johnny. Just important to also consider this slide is slightly out of date in terms of just status, but essentially the principle remains the same. So NIS2 is part of an overall EU legislative landscape. So there's things like the European Cybersecurity Act, which provides legal basis for all of this. There's NIS2, which we're going to discuss today. Cybersecurity Act, Cyber Resilience Act, which will it's fair to say Europe are really upping their game and then enforcing this across all European countries or at the EA. In terms of not just addressing, obviously, service providers and organizations, but addressing the products and services they use. So the Cyber Resilience Act coming will force product vendors, software vendors, etc., with substantial digital elements to really address the security of their product. Because as we know, that's a significant vulnerability in terms of overall organizations as well, in terms of the product security or service security of that organizations use. The legal, banking, financial services and insurance sector are ahead of the game here in that they're implementing their flavour of NIS2, i.e. DORA, the Digital Operation and Resilience Act, and are well down the track, almost a year into it at this stage, and building the resilience of that sector. And then there's electronic directives and a variety of other sectoral specific implementations across Europe that will apply. And then, they're obviously the cyber security focused legislation, but there's obviously other elements such as the Artificial Intelligence Act that has significant digital elements that are being legislated for as well. And then there's no specific cybersecurity. So it's an architecture of cybersecurity that is important to address the critical entities, the products and services that they consume and use, and obviously use of other technologies such as artificial intelligence, etc. as well. So hopefully it all joins up and fits together, and that's the plan. Next slide, please, Johnny. So I guess what this webinar is focused on today is a deep dive into, I guess, some of the specific requirements. So again, people should be aware that, in terms of the implementation of NIS and how prescriptive, I guess, we're getting in terms of what is to be implemented and how, which again, I think is good and will drive, I suppose, that common approach to securing these critical and essential services. There's a couple of key things that have been announced by the National Cybersecurity Centre and are now in play and need to be considered. So the National Cybersecurity Centre have produced what's called Risk Management Measures, RMMs. A draft version of that has been published and has been updated recently. And they're focusing on the primary obligations for the entities in scope and of what's contained in a number of articles under the NIS directive, specifically 3, 20, 21 and 23 of the directive. There's 16 risk management measures. Again, we're not going to go through all of those today, but I would highly recommend organizations download and look at those because it's getting very, very prescriptive about what organizations should do if they're in scope and regulated. And those RMMs are broken down into kind of foundational actions, which are the minimum controls that are required to meet the legislative requirements, and then supporting actions, which are effectively enhancing controls, which may be required depending on your specific risk assessment of the sector you're in and your environment, etc. today. And today, this webinar is focusing very specifically on, and there's 16 of those RMMs, and very specifically focusing on RMM 014, which is incident handling, and a little bit of impact, obviously, on RMM 015, which is incident reporting. And aside from the RMMs, which are very important and very useful, it's also worth looking at, again, the NCSC in Ireland has become an owner of what's called a cyber fund, CIFUN, or cyber fundamentals, which is very much the how. So the RMMs are what you're supposed to do. The cyber fundamentals is an example of the how. This is voluntary, but I think people need to pay attention to this because, again, it's very prescriptive around maturity, how to implement the appropriate controls and a way of demonstrating it. And Cyber Fundamentals draws on not just the RMMs, but obviously other controls like CIS, IEC 62443 for OT, and it's important to say that NIS2 brings OT into scope, as well as IT systems of the regulated entities, and it draws on things like ISO. It draws also on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, so it draws on that standard kind of life cycle and approach here. So it takes the best of established controls and frameworks that are out there, and then it works on a kind of a prescriptive mechanism to implement those with appropriate levels of maturity. So it takes into account capability, maturity, and implementation. It's voluntary. People don't have to follow Siphon. They can, if you're ISO based, etc., you can use those information security management systems to kind of demonstrate this as well. But this is going to be the language, I guess, that NCSE and the various regulating entities will be looking at and using to assess your implementation of NIS2. I think it's very useful. It's very positive. And just as an indicator, so this I think was developed initially by the Belgian government and the Belgian NCSE. Ireland, the Irish NCSE has taken co-ownership of this. I think Romania has also adopted this. So it is probably highly likely that this framework will be rolled out Europe-wide. So this is probably going to be the language of how to implement, and the RMMs, etc., being what to implement across the regions. So it's worth looking at this, but organizations don't have to adopt it. If they have their own framework for implementation, that's fine. But I think it is worth looking for. It is worth looking at. Yeah, so that's the next slide, please, Johnny. I suppose the last point is then the who. So apart from obviously the regulated entities, so questions that organizations need to look at is, am I in scope and am I regulated? And then who is going to be regulating this? So given the NCSC's scope of NIS2 has moved from 78 organizations to potentially 4,000 to 6,000 organizations that are going to be regulated, obviously the NCSC is not in a position to drive regulation into all of those entities, and those entities will have specific sectoral issues to be dealt with that would be sensitive, whether you're in energy or transportation or whatever. So the NCSC are then delegating to the various regulatory bodies who are going to regulate the various sectors, and I've listed those out there. So COMREG, as you'd expect, for digital infrastructure, telecoms, etc. CRU for energy, wastewater, etc. Central bank is obviously regulating the financial services sector, and that's the DORA requirement. And then the transport bodies, for rail, aviation, etc. And then NCSE is regulating, pretty much everything else. So there's a substantial number of regulators upping their game in terms of cyber regulation to address the specifics of each of those sectors. And again, the common language of all of this, with the exception of financial services, would be something like the RMMs, NIS2 and Siphon as kind of the common language too. So you can see the consistency of approach and why they're being prescriptive here. So that's just some background, and I guess now we're going to dive into the specifics of the services that are going to be utilized, if you like, to try and gain compliance and address the requirements specifically of RMM 14 and 15. Over to you, Johnny.
Thanks, Pat. Look, I wanted to kick off straight away by just kind of putting the slide together. What I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is, as Pat said, go into RMM 014 and 015, more to the practical side of it. What do you need to know? What's changed from the initial guidance? But I think as a starting point, as some of the latest research that has been provided by Hiscox showed that 40% of Irish businesses suffered a cyber attack in the last 12 months, and 70% paid a ransom, right? Okay. The reason why this is really important is that when you look at your NIS2 guidance, the specific elements that they require you to have, and we'll go into that detail, is around a plan and action to be able to respond in the event of an incident, right? And there's clear timelines with regards to that, which I'll cover over the next couple of slides. And the really kind of big point from organizations is, can you detect, right? Because beforehand it's just notify. Can you detect and can you respond? Because when we get into the specific details of what they ask for, you need to ensure that you have the right level of capability to support that and to be able to provide the necessary information, right? So that's just kind of the first point within moving from detection to response. Specifically, the incident handling part of the RMM 001, which is the NCSC draft, it's definitely worthwhile having a look, as Pat said. Inside it, gives you really granular detail on what you need to utilize as an organization. And I know there's some people here on the call today that are based out of the UK, but what I do think is that a lot of these guidance is going to apply across the board. So even if you want, we'll share after this the draft Irish version, because it links very clearly in the appendixes. The RMM specifically will cover now to the specific controls needed, and then links it to, as Pat said, ISO, CIFON, and NIST. So therefore, if you've already gone on a journey from ISO or NIST, you don't have to duplicate the work. They've done it for you and mapping it back. So let's just talk about the foundational actions, because they're going to be the ones that are specifically required for most organizations under NIS2, right? But if you look at foundational, there's foundational 1 to 4, 1 to 8, and then there is 24, I think, specific ones around supporting actions. And 1 to 8, it's really around establishing an incident response policy and plan, ensuring that within your organizations that you have both the roles and responsibilities and the escalation paths defined, and how it's integrated in your wider risk management framework. So you're really setting up the accountability, the ownership, and the process to detect and respond to incidents. Some of the points that within the fundamentals, which I thought was quite interesting, because it would be something that I would speak to organizations quite often. It's around testing this plan. So it's not good enough just to have the plan. You now need to test the plan. Typically, we'll get into it later. What does that look like in terms of how you can do it? It's around tabletops and simulations. And also, one of the key aspects around awareness is linking it back to your BCP plan. So therefore, what is the processes that you have in place? So when an incident happens, if you've detected something in your network, how do you initiate your BCP plan, right? And why that's really interesting, in my view, is firstly, you have to be able to detect it, right? To link your BCP plan in place to make sure that your organizations to continue to operate. And that's where you move down to a requirement for a SOC theme, which is not specifically called out in the foundational elements, but is mentioned directly in the supporting actions. And that was a big difference between the initial guidance provided by the NCSE and NIS2 versus the RMMs now, because within SA01 and SA24, they go into a lot of detail, which covers off exactly what needs to be logged, or recommendations what needs to be logged. It provides information on the types of actions and escalations completed and responses from not specifically for a third-party SOC, but for your SOC, right? So they don't define anything between third-party or internal. It's all about your service. So it's either done by yourselves or by SMEs. It also goes through skills, which was always quite interesting. It specifically links to SMEs specializing in the area, and also with the fact that it's covering elements where you have to log, where previously a SOC could be just a managed detection and response based on your endpoint telemetry. Now it's going into fully XDR elements around the supporting actions. The question, if I was you, is going, am I in scope for the supporting actions? It's more geared to customers in the in essential entities, potentially. But then you have to consider, as Pat said in the first slide, is are you going to be required to have this in place based on the downstream supply chain, right? So I think that's for your organization to figure out. And specifically SA22 within the RMM in Ireland calls out a SIEM, which was the first time I've seen something put there. But let's take that one a little bit forward. And I think this is when I spoke about NIS2 to teams and businesses a year ago. This is all we had, right? So it's come on a long way, and I think that's why I think it's interesting when we're refreshing and mapping back to what's happening right now. So if you talk about the incident response practices, it hasn't changed. The timelines are still there, but the mechanisms around what you have to do at each time is different. And that's specifically called out in the RMM 015 section. So early warning signals must be provided to your competent authority 24 hours and they've defined in this area what that means, and that is either a cross-border impact or a serious incident. So that's the threshold of what it says in that scenario. But when you get to the 72-hour one, I think the key piece that I picked up on is when you get into more detail, they're specifically calling out how did you detect the indicators of compromise, severity, and impact. And that there's a good bit of work from a security operations processes in place for that. So you do need to ensure that you have the right detection capability in place to detect attacks on your environment. And then we go a bit further in that area 1 month after. You have to provide a final report, and that has to close what actions you took, the root cause analysis required, and specifically details around the investigation. So I think the key piece being, if we go back to your plan and plan for this, you need to ensure that you have had the necessary plan in place, you've executed that plan correctly, and then be able to have the SMEs to provide the reports in this case. So now just let's talk about the key points and the foundations, right? Because that's more than likely it's going to apply to most people on the call today. The element within the foundationals doesn't make it that difficult to achieve, but the question being, can you achieve it internally yourself, or do you need support from a third-party provider? So the starting one, the key point of the first one, or FA01, is to establish and maintain an incident response policy and plan. So essentially within your teams, you need to define the roles, responsibilities, and escalation paths. And in our experience, that's not just the IT team. This is bringing in your business teams, your application owners, your data protection officers, and executives in the business that will be able to make decisions in the event of an incident, right? The second element is to enable reporting and triage for employees, suppliers, and customers to detect and assess incidents early. So what we're saying there is that you need to have clearly communicated across your business, if someone sees an incident, what actions need to be taken. So that is your run book to be able to demonstrate to NIS2 that you have a plan, procedure, and policy in place. The next part then, what they specifically call out, is the integration with your business continuity management. So therefore, what they're saying in this scenario is, in the event of an incident, cyber or otherwise, you need to ensure that your incident response plan doesn't just talk about reporting, it talks about the actions that you can take to ensure you BCP is in place so that your company continues to operate, and what needs to be done in that scenario. Is that, like, if we get into practicalities, if you had to shut down your whole organization right now, what services can stay online? What could be shut down? Can you revert to pen and paper? How do you get payroll running, right? How do you pay staff? How do you pay suppliers? If you're providing critical infrastructure to companies, just say, for example, with Ekco, we're seen as an essential entity. We provide services to large organizations in this area. So therefore, in the event that we lost connectivity, what's our BCP plan to ensure that we can continue to operate and support you? And we have one in place, right? And then finally, when we get to the last two, is to ensure that you have compliance with the regulatory reporting, as I called out in the last couple of slides. And then finally, to test this. And essentially that can be done in two ways. You can test it via a tabletop exercise where you bring everyone into the room and run through the plan together. You can do a scenario-based one where you essentially bring in an SME who is geared first in running these, where they will create a scenario. They will set a number of different injects, for example. You can put a ransomware attack. You give information around that. Your data has been leaked online. What actions take? Do we investigate further? Do we take our business offline? These are the questions that you need to pose within a tabletop exercise to ensure that everyone is on the same page, right? When do you go to the press? What do you say to the press, etc.? So they're the foundational controls that are needed in place. Hope that makes sense. But then going forward, we go to the supporting actions. And I think the key aspect here, it's really gearing to giving you requirements which would be in a modern next generation SIEM SOC XDR service, where you're providing unified visibility across your endpoints, network, identity, and cloud. It doesn't say AI right in it, but what we're talking there is they talk about reducing your time to respond, to detect, right? So if we look at where next generation solutions in this area, we're talking about AI-driven correlation to be able for us to respond quicker, automated response playbooks. Inside this is this, they indicate what actions are going to be taken automatically. And then you have to have the necessary SOC analysts in place to contain, recover, and document the actions. They specifically called out documentation, which is a key one for any SOC, so that you have a guide to what's required there and everything in terms of response. And then from a recovery and lessons learned, if we go back to RNN05 specifically, there's a huge loop in this area around continuous improvement. So it's not just talking about having a SOC. If you've seen some issues, that you have to have processes in place within your organization to loop back and to strengthen that. And just take that just for 1 second then on this area is then if we talk about, look, this is from an Ekco perspective, right? Just how do we operate as an organization? And what we would say is that, and some of you might have seen this before, is that we believe that the information that's provided between SA01 and SA24 are the fundamentals required in a modern day SOC solution. You need to respond quicker. You need to take actions on behalf of the customer. You can't just catch and dispatch tickets. So our modern SOC solutions, here's an example of one with Sentinel Defender. We have a SOAR solution. We have AI built in. We have automated actions. We have clear documented processes, which make sure that we can respond quicker. We have integrated threat intelligence. And no matter what, they are the questions you need to be asking if you're looking to kind of move out to another SOC provider. I'll take a break for a second there, and just Pat, was there anything that you'd add here, or?
No, I think you're covering it well, Johnny. I think like the point is that there is a lot in this, and I know some of the questions that we're seeing coming in, people are sort of saying, "How do I do this?" We're a small IT team, or we're an organization, we don't have this capability, etc. So I think there's a couple of points. One, obviously, you need to think about the requirements of the RMMs, and then secondly, how you're going to accomplish and achieve it, and not all of it is going to be insourced or outsourced. You're going to need to come up with an appropriate mix of supply and services. I think the other point, you've seen this from DORA and you're seeing it across the theme, is proportionality. So the notion of maturity and siphon, etc. That obviously if you're a critical entity with a very high risk profile, etc., there will be higher levels around expectations about the maturity of the solution and the service that you either build or buy or have a hybrid service for. Whereas obviously if you're an organization that maybe is a less risk profile, smaller, less critical services, etc., there's a degree of proportionality to be applied in all of this. That's important too. But it does come back to the core point here, which is there's nothing required here that really doesn't reflect what you should be doing in any case, just reflecting the current risk environment, the current threats, the current challenges that organizations have. So, if you're not doing this is probably something that is on your critical path. It should be on your critical path to do in any case. If you're doing it, but maybe doing it in a rudimentary fashion with the continuous improvement requirements and mindset in place, then you need to substantially up the value you're getting from this type of service and the scope of sources that are being analyzed, the context that's been applied, and then the detection and response pathways that are followed as well.
Thanks, Pat. And I think, look, the one thing that I want to just note is that sometimes when you see all this detail, it might, like for someone who may not be technical or understand the in-depth aspects of cybersecurity, it might look daunting or scary. There's a lot in this. But what I would say is probably invested already in some of these technologies. For example, you could have an EDR solution in place with Microsoft Defender. You have the Microsoft 365, Office 365, and you might have the licenses already that is detecting this. And everything that you see on our screen here, just say, for example, with Ekco, this is plug and play, right? So it's not something that you need to worry about in this area. We've designed this in the background, but I think that's what you need to see from any provider in that space. So if we go kind of a step further then, just in terms of the documentation actions and metrics with regard to a modern SOC service, you need to, no matter what you see, and here's an example of what we do, you'll need to see elements around, is your organization, is the SOC providing a mean time to detect or mean time to respond? You know, do they have the right level of resourcing and skills to be able to meet that? Are you getting a very clear viewpoint of the incidents, the SLAs, the ticket status, what's happened, what actions were taken? Because the question being is, one, your SOC service should be providing that. And secondly, in the space is that if something was to happen, and you always have to plan for the inevitable, you need to ensure that you have the necessary documentation in place to be able to support the evidence to the competent authorities. So if something has been triggered by a SOC, right, at that point, the investigation will complete straight away. What actions were taken? Can you document all of that? Have they been able to identify the IOCs as indicated within that area? And what measures has the SOC with you taken to be able to meet your fundamental mandatory reporting requirements? And then look, just for me, then just kind of final takeaways, right, is that, you know, NIS2 isn't just a checkbox now, it's now looking at demonstrating resilience. So if we look at that, the key elements in this area, it's around detecting in real time, evidence, actions taken, having the IR documentation, the metrics in place. And that's going to be just very much a process and procedure exercise. And you have to be able to recover and learn. Your SOC must integrate into your BCP and your incident response processes. So it's very much essential that when you're putting together a detection and response service, that it aligns with your wider business objectives and it's not just detecting. And then for me, the biggest one from the RMM which was issued by the Irish government is that when they started adding specific log sources within the SOC, it's now not good enough for MDR. You have to look at XDR and SIEM, which I think is the right way to go, because if we look at the global attack vectors, 80% of attacks are now identity-based attacks. They're not going to be picked up by just endpoint detection alone. So I think that was some of the interesting parts that reading the latest guidance for the Irish government and the RMMs provided. So that's everything I have right now. Any questions, anyone?
Thank you both very much for that. If anyone does have any questions, you can pop them into that Q&A box. We've none come in there, but I did have a few emailed in just beforehand. So I'm conscious of time. I think we've about 5 minutes left. The first one is, say one of our suppliers doesn't meet NIS2 security expectations. What's a realistic way to manage that risk without cutting them off entirely? Who would like to?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Realistically, your supplier is not NIS2 obliged unless they're NIS2 obliged, right? So the fact that you're NIS2 obliged doesn't really mean that your suppliers are NIS2 obliged unless they fit the criteria to be NIS2 obliged. But I guess, you know, as you look at what you have to do to be compliant, you're then going to kind of flow down those questions and the similar approach down to your supply chain. So the important point is, yeah, like your suppliers are not NIS2 obliged. They don't have to follow, obviously, you know, the guidance in RMMs and NIS2 unless they're in scope for NIS2 themselves. And like the ultimate philosophy in all of this is that you are demonstrating. I mean, first and foremost, back to the original point, you know, you're doing this compliance because obviously, okay, you're compliant and you have to be compliant, but you're doing this compliance to protect your organization, right? That's the fundamental point here that you need to address first. So I guess if you are currently doing rigorous supply chain risk assessment, due diligence, then you just incorporate what you're doing into the current framework, right? So that's what you do, and you have evidence of that, and you demonstrate that, and you do it. That's the important point. The second thing is this is risk based, so it's not like every supplier has to have the same level of due diligence and controls and reassurance. So your critical suppliers are the ones to focus on. Your lesser suppliers, you might, in terms of risk to your organization, you would probably have less requirements of in its own right. I mean, regardless of compliance, just looking at the current environment out there right now, because of supply chain risk, means that organizations are enforcing quite rigorous due diligence on supply chain, regardless of compliance. If you've a tightly integrated supply chain, tightly coupled suppliers into your digital environments, et cetera, just based on the risk profile, if you look what's happened in recent attacks in the UK and across Europe and the US, the organizations have been attacked by their supply chain or through their supply chain, not by but through their supply chain. So there's a natural occurrence happening anyway in terms of rigorous risk assessment and requirements in terms of demonstration of security capability and maturity happening currently already without NIS2. So NIS2, you just take that dynamic and you apply it, and you operate a risk-based approach where you expect more from your critical and important suppliers, and you probably have less requirements and obligations on your less significant, less important suppliers. I think in terms of cutting suppliers off, like realistically, this NIS program is going to take probably 1 to 2 years to really start in earnest in terms of rollout and deployment and integration. It's probably a 5-year program in terms of implementation anyway. So I think if you're demonstrating that somebody isn't compliant and you've agreed a roadmap to compliance or to appropriate risk remediation on the part of those suppliers, I think that's probably adequate to say that, well, we identified that they were deficient in the following areas, but we've agreed under contractual terms that they're going to remedy that and demonstrate to us in 6 months that they're going to be compliant. Then, that again is probably demonstrating progress in the timelines of the implementation, the realistic implementation and operation of something like NIS.
I think, Kirsten, as well, if you just take that a tiny bit to what does that really mean in practicality kind of element. So, I've ran due diligences for large enterprises for quite a long time, right? We're asking some customers that were managing full managed services 200-300 questions in due diligence, right? But you're not going to ask this. You might actually ask, because that's the process of sending the 300 questions out to someone who's an architect firm, right? They don't have connections to you. They don't have all your data. They don't have people logging in. So the risk profile is completely different. So it doesn't, as Pat said, it's very objective, right? What happens is people standardize processes and they send out the same due diligence to everyone. But realistically, when it comes back to it, they're not going to strike you off because it doesn't actually affect the risk of the organization who's NIS2 in the first place.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually sent an invoice to our own accounts department the other day. It was a charity donation. I was like, can we get this sorted? And they sent me back a supplier list. I was like, what? And then I think they were, just being super diligent. So I get it. It's nuanced. And it's a really good point that it isn't just about being compliant. And of course, that is important. But ultimately, you have to protect the business. Number one.
What's also going to help organizations here too is, there is a move towards certification, and there will be obviously certification schemes for NIS2 organizations, but there is a conversation happening around certification for Irish SMEs. The UK has it obviously with things like Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. So there is active conversations happening at an industry level, probably going to be operated maybe through the NCSE, about ultimately certification for SMEs to a similar or like standard for something like Cyber Essentials, or maybe a small version of Siphon or something like that. And that would be very useful in terms of those SMEs in the supply chain demonstrating compliance upwards through their supply chain to NIS2 obliged organizations, but also just peer-to-peer, in terms of the scenario you've described there, Kirsten. That certification for SMEs is, I think, anticipated maybe that it might take, 24 months or something like that to work towards. But I know with my Cyber Ireland hat on, it's something that organizations like ISME, etc., have been really screaming for and asking for. And that's not just NIS related, it is just simply cyber insurance, due diligence related, and it's B2B related in terms of operations to demonstrate your compliance. So I think a SME standard for cyber security would be very useful here as well, because a lot of SMEs can't afford maybe something like ISO 27001 isn't appropriate. So a cyber essentials like SME standard, I think, would be very useful here in terms of demonstrating that compliance. It's an active conversation. When it comes, how it comes, I'm not ultimately sure, but I know it's a very active conversation amongst SME, between Cyber Ireland and Cyber Ireland out to organisations like ISME and IBEC, etc.
Okay. Look, I'm conscious of time, so I might just ask one more question. It's board level accountability. How are companies handling that in practice? Because this is new, right? As part of NIS2.
I'm spending a lot of my time briefing boards. A lot of boards are not aware of this. The fact that there's major fines associated with it, the fact that there's director responsibility and significant sanctions in NIS2. So NIS2, similar to GDPR, now has significant teeth, and that teeth is not just fines, but it is directorial responsibility and C-level and directorial responsibility, and significant sanctions against individuals in their roles as well. So a lot of time is spent educating boards on that. I think that more mature organizations that are ahead of the curve, that awareness is now out there. And I think the fact that you see those organizations now effectively starting their NIS2 programs means that I think that message has got through to the organizations that are aware of it. There's a significant amount of organizations that perhaps don't fully appreciate the impact of this. There's a significant amount of organizations waiting for the starting gun, as in when the legislation is transposed. I think that's naive, because I think you're behind the curve waiting for it. But yeah, so it's an education awareness piece, and I think the people that are educated and aware, you can see activity already associated with it.
I think as well, just to close on that, I was asked the exact question like that from a CFO recently. He asked me, in light of Marks and Spencer's and Land Rover Jaguar breaches, how are the security controls that they purchased from Ekco addressing that specific risk? Because it was a question from their board. So we had to put together a business viewpoint of that, about data together, and anyone here who's an Ekco customer, happy to put that together for awareness, because today, it all depends on what exactly you're buying, what's in scope, right? So therefore we're able to look at what they have today with us and put a very business clear kind of viewpoint on what's the scope and what's the residual risk. And then we had a presentation with the CFO that he brought to his board, and I was very interested. He said, I didn't know any of this beforehand. I didn't really quantify and understand what that service I pay for does, and now I do. So I think it is an education piece, because they have so many other responsibilities. The cyber and the IT side is seen as something that just runs in the background. So sometimes it is important to take one of these global attacks and just say, do I have the necessary to protect against it, or should I be investing more? Because if you're an IT manager, or if you're someone trying to get the business to buy in, right, they're going to go, I'm already giving you enough money, right? And that's just the way it is, right? So if you go back and go, okay, here's Land Rover Jaguar, this is what happened, this is what we have today, it's what we pay for, this is the residual risk. Can you own this residual risk? That's where things, that's what NIS is trying to get to. NIS2 is trying to get to that exact point. It's going that you are aware of the risk, that you own the risk, and you take the mitigating actions to address it. Either accept it or you invest, right? So look, it's an interesting kind of thing to do, and happy to support anyone here who wants to do that.
One last point, Kirsten. I think not more than board level is just becoming aware of the responsibilities. Not a lot of organizations are fully aware that NIS2 brings their operational technology environment into scope. And as we know, operational technology, for good business reasons in the past, in a lot of cases, effectively is relatively immature in terms of its approach to cybersecurity. They have different business drivers. It's about getting product out the door, keeping services available, etc., etc. But I suppose the historic ignoring of best practice security that has gone on in OT environments now needs to be addressed as well. And that seemed like a major shock to some of the boards that you're briefing, to say this environment that we know has been insecure, that we've been focusing on very much on availability and safety, we suddenly do need to do something about it and address. And it's not just your classic OT environments of your manufacturing or your utilities. It is also what I would call grey OT. So, into health sector, into areas where there is technology that maybe is not strictly or classically defined as OT is now in scope as well. And that is a major piece of work that organizations need to address if they do have OT or grey OT environments.
Okay, well, thank you both for that. And if anybody does need that one pager that Johnny just mentioned, feel free to reach out and we can get that sorted for you. But thank you all for your time, and thank you to Johnny and Pat for giving up their time to pass on their knowledge. I will share this on after the call later today. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks.